Somewhere in your family, there is probably a story about a great-great-grandmother. She had high cheekbones, maybe dark hair, maybe dark eyes, maybe a temper nobody could ever quite explain. And somewhere along the way, someone in the family started calling her a Cherokee princess. You have probably heard some version of this story, even if the details are fuzzy, even if nobody in the family can quite agree on which grandmother it was, or which side of the family she came from, or how many generations back she actually sits. Here's a number that might surprise you. In the 2010 census, over 800,000 Americans identified as having Cherokee ancestry, more than any other tribal identity claimed anywhere in the country, by a massive margin over the next closest nation. The combined enrolled citizenship of all three federally recognized Cherokee tribes combined is roughly 330,000 people. More than twice as many Americans claim a Cherokee ancestor as there are documented, enrolled Cherokee citizens alive today. So where did all these family stories come from? Are they lies? Are millions of American families simply making this up out of nowhere? The real answer is almost never that simple, and understanding it means understanding two things at once. Why this specific myth became so universal across the American South and Appalachia in particular, spreading through countless unrelated families who have never met each other, and why a DNA test, no matter what percentage it shows you, can never actually answer the question your family has been asking for generations, no matter how much you might want it to. Before we start, this video is not sponsored by any testing company, and I have no affiliate deals. I'm here to help you understand the real history behind this story, not to sell you anything. Let us get into it. First, the reason there is no such thing as a Cherokee princess, and never was, in the entire documented history of the Cherokee people. Cherokee villages were traditionally led by chiefs, but these were not hereditary monarchs passing a crown down through bloodline the way European royal families operated for centuries. Cherokee leadership positions were earned through community standing, oratory skill, spiritual authority, and demonstrated wisdom over years of service to the community, not inherited automatically at birth, simply because of who your father happened to be. There was no princess because there was no throne to inherit in the first place, and no royal family structure for a princess title to attach itself to. The title almost certainly grew out of a mistranslation, an attempt by European settlers to describe a chief's daughter using the only cultural framework they personally had available for understanding female status and inherited leadership, a framework borrowed directly and somewhat clumsily from European monarchy. A chief's daughter held real social standing within her community, comparable in some ways to the daughter of a highly respected modern political or spiritual leader, but she was never a princess in any literal, technical sense, and the Cherokee people themselves never used, recognized, or claimed the term for themselves at any point in their own history. Second, why this particular myth attached itself so specifically to Cherokee identity rather than any of the dozens of other tribal nations across the country. Historians studying the phenomenon point to several converging factors that all point in the same direction. The Cherokee were among the largest and most well-documented tribal nations in the Southeast prior to removal, meaning their name was simply more widely known to the broader American public than dozens of smaller neighboring nations. The Chickasaw, the Catawba, the Yuchi, whose names most Americans today have simply never encountered or learned in school. The Cherokee were also historically referred to by white American settlers and government officials as one of the 5 civilized tribes, a term rooted in 19th century assumptions about which native nations had visibly adopted European-style governance, agriculture, dress, and even written language, and that visibility and familiarity meant Cherokee identity was already a recognizable, comfortable reference point in the white American imagination by the time family stories began forming and hardening across later generations of descendants, who were several steps removed from any actual documented connection. Third, the specific historical mechanism that planted so many of these stories in the first place, and it is more grounded in documented fact than most people assume, intermarriage along the frontier. Before the Indian Removal Act of 1830, European and Cherokee communities lived and worked in close proximity throughout what is now Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, trading goods, sharing land boundaries, and building genuine relationships across cultural lines that modern Americans rarely picture when they imagine early frontier life. Scots-Irish traders in particular frequently married Cherokee women as part of ordinary trade relationships and everyday community life along the frontier, unions that were documented, recognized, and in many cases produced children who were fully accepted within Cherokee kinship structures. These marriages were real. They were common enough to be unremarkable at the time, and they produced real mixed heritage children and real family lines that persisted for generations afterward, scattering across the Southeast and eventually across the entire country as those descendants moved, migrated, and intermarried further. A family story about a Cherokee ancestor is, in a meaningful percentage of cases, rooted in something that genuinely happened on the ground, even if the specific details, the name, the exact date, The precise relationship softened and shifted as the story passed from grandmother to granddaughter over 150 years of retelling at kitchen tables. Fourth, the reason the story frequently changes tribes or nationalities entirely from one generation to the next within the exact same family, a detail many people find confusing, but which actually tells its own quiet historical story. Historians researching family oral tradition have documented a specific and recurring pattern across many unrelated families in different states. After the Indian Removal Act, openly identifying as Cherokee or as any indigenous nation carried enormous legal and social risk in parts of the South, affecting land rights, legal standing, and basic personal safety. Families with documented or suspected indigenous ancestry sometimes adopted alternative explanations for their appearance and their heritage, describing an ancestor as Portuguese or Spanish, or using the phrase Black Dutch, a cover story that could plausibly explain darker features or unusual traditions without the specific danger attached to openly claiming indigenous identity in that particular era and that particular region. As the danger faded across later generations, and as being Cherokee slowly shifted from a liability into something closer to a point of pride or curiosity, some families reached back into half-remembered fragments of the original story. And because Cherokee was by far the most widely known tribal name available to them in the broader culture, the vague memory of indigenous ancestry often crystallized specifically into a Cherokee story, whether or not the original ancestor was actually Cherokee at all, or indigenous at all in some documented cases. Researchers have traced back to their actual historical source. Fifth, why this particular myth became specifically attached to the American South and Appalachia, rather than spreading evenly across the entire country. Scholars researching the pattern describe it as serving a very specific cultural function, a way of asserting deep, authentic native-born American roots and independence, values closely tied to a particular regional identity and to a certain vision of frontier self-reliance. Academic researcher Joel Martin has noted that an extraordinary number of Southerners specifically claim a grandmother or great-grandmother who was, in the family telling, some kind of Cherokee princess, and that this story serves settler purposes, aligning American frontier romance and a sense of regional pride with a claim to indigenous authenticity, all in a single, tidy family legend passed down without anyone examining it too closely. Subscribe right now because the next 2 points cover exactly why a DNA test cannot answer the one question your family has actually been asking all along, and what tribal nations themselves have said directly, publicly, and repeatedly about a case that made national headlines over exactly this issue. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Sixth, why a DNA test result, whatever it shows, cannot answer whether your family's Cherokee story is true and cannot make you Cherokee. This is the single most important and most widely misunderstood part of this entire subject, the part that trips up even people who have done real, careful genealogical research otherwise. Commercial DNA tests can detect broad genetic markers associated with indigenous American ancestry as a category, but they cannot currently distinguish which specific tribal nation those markers came from, and they were never designed to make that distinction in the first place. Cherokee Nation Secretary of State Chuck Hoskin Jr. has stated this directly and unambiguously in public comments specifically addressing this exact confusion. A DNA test is useless to determine tribal citizenship, and current DNA tests do not even distinguish whether a person's ancestors were indigenous to North or South America, let alone which of the hundreds of distinct tribal nations across 2 entire continents a person's ancestors actually belong to. This is not a limitation the Cherokee Nation invented to be difficult or exclusionary. It is a basic scientific limitation of the technology itself, openly acknowledged by the testing companies as well, buried in the fine print most customers never read all the way through. Seventh, and this is the part almost nobody explains clearly, tribal citizenship has never been based on genetics in the way most people naturally assume, and that is by deliberate design, not oversight or bureaucratic stubbornness. Cherokee Nation citizenship requires tracing a documented lineal ancestor back to the Dawes Rolls, a federal census of Cherokee citizens taken between 1898 and 1906, an official government document produced by a federal commission, not a blood test administered in a lab. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians requires a documented ancestor on the 1924 Baker Roll, along with a minimum blood quantum calculated specifically from that historical roll, not from a modern DNA sample submitted decades or a century later. The United Kituwa Band requires a documented ancestor on their own 1949 base roll, along with its own separate blood quantum requirement. All 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes explicitly state, in their own official enrollment documentation, that DNA results, family photographs, oral histories passed down through the family, and home genealogy research on their own cannot substitute for documented paper records, connecting a specific applicant to a specific enrolled ancestor by name. Anthropologist Kim Tallbear, who has studied this issue extensively throughout her academic career, explains that indigenous identity is fundamentally a matter of political citizenship, culture, kinship, and lived experience within a specific community, not an ancestry percentage calculated from a distant, unverifiable relative several generations removed. Tribal nations are sovereign political entities, similar in this specific sense to any other nation on Earth, and just as no DNA test could ever grant someone Japanese or French citizenship, regardless of what percentage it showed, no DNA test can grant Cherokee citizenship either, no matter how strong or how surprising the result. This became a highly visible public issue in 2018, when a DNA test result was presented publicly as evidence supporting a specific individual's claimed Cherokee heritage during a political controversy that drew national media attention. The Cherokee Nation responded immediately and unambiguously, reiterating this exact point in public statements to national news outlets, that tribal citizenship is a matter of documented lineage and legal political affiliation, not genetics, and that using a DNA test this way fundamentally misunderstood, and in the tribe's own words undermined, the nation's sovereignty over its own citizenship and its own right to define itself on its own terms. 7 points. There was never a Cherokee princess because there was never a throne for one to inherit. Only a mistranslation borrowed from a European framework that never fit in the first place. The myth attached itself to the Cherokee, specifically because they were the most visible, most widely known tribal nation in the white American imagination of the time. Real intermarriage along the frontier planted real family lines that genuinely connect many American families to genuine Cherokee ancestors, even now, generations later. The story changes tribes and nationalities across generations, because families once had real, urgent reasons to hide the truth, and later generations reached for the one tribal name everyone already knew. The myth took root, specifically in the South and Appalachia, because it served a very particular kind of regional identity and frontier pride. No DNA test can ever answer the question, because the technology was never built to distinguish one tribal nation from another, and tribal citizenship itself was never based on genetics to begin with, built instead on documented paper records and political sovereignty that predate DNA testing by well over a century. So where does that leave your family's story? If your family has always said there was a Cherokee ancestor somewhere back in the family tree, that story deserves real investigation, not dismissal, and not blind acceptance either, since both extremes skip past the actual work of finding out what really happened. The path forward is genealogical research, not a spit tube and a 6-week wait for a percentage on a screen. Start by building your documented family tree backward using census records, land deeds, marriage records, and church records, working steadily toward the early 1800s, the era when frontier intermarriage was most common throughout the Cherokee homeland regions of the Southeast. Then search the actual historical rolls, the same documents the tribes themselves rely on. The 1835 Cherokee census, sometimes called the Henderson Roll, documents who was living within the Cherokee Nation immediately before removal began. The Dawes Rolls, compiled between 1898 and 1907, remain the enrollment basis for the modern Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the largest of the 3 federally recognized tribes by a wide margin. The Baker Roll from 1924 covers the eastern band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina specifically, and the 1949 Base Roll covers the United Kituwa Band. If you find a documented ancestor connecting your family tree to one of these historical rolls, you have something far more meaningful than any DNA percentage could ever provide, an actual verifiable answer, grounded in the exact same historical record the tribes themselves use to determine citizenship today. And if you do not find that connection after searching thoroughly, that does not necessarily mean the family story was invented from nothing or told in bad faith. It may simply mean the ancestor in question was never formally enrolled on any surviving roll, was one of the many Cherokee individuals who assimilated and quietly disappeared from official records entirely during a dangerous era, or belonged to a different indigenous nation entirely, whose specific name was eventually lost across generations and replaced by the one tribal name almost every American family already knew by heart. If your family has always told this story, here is what to actually do with it, practically and respectfully. Treat it as a genuine lead worth investigating with real historical records, not as a settled fact to repeat unquestioned at every family gathering, and not as an embarrassing myth to be quietly dropped and never mentioned again either. The Cherokee National Research Center in Oklahoma and the Museum of the Cherokee People in North Carolina both offer genealogy research services for exactly this kind of question, staffed by people who do this work professionally and who can point you toward records you might never find searching alone. Approach that research with documents already in hand, rather than only the family story itself, since the people staffing these services have spent their careers distinguishing a genuine documented connection from a romanticized family legend. And they deserve that respect, along with your patience and your willingness to do the groundwork first. The records are free to search. The real story, whatever it turns out to be, is almost always more specific, more human, and more meaningful than a single inherited word passed down without its original context intact. Subscribe right now if this video changed the way you think about a story your own family has told for generations. Every week on this channel, we go this deep into the real history behind the family stories most Americans have never had fully explained to them. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Has your family always told a story about Cherokee ancestry? Have you traced it back through the actual historical rolls, and what did you find? Tell me your family's story and which records you have searched so far. This is where the real conversations happen on this channel. Share this with every family that has repeated this story for generations without ever knowing where it came from, because the records are free, and the real history behind that story is far more interesting and far more important than a single word passed down without its context.